Right. DORA is a community with shared aspirations to improve academic assessment, and we're all working towards the same goal. Participants are expected to follow the community conduct rules of DORA's administrative entity, the American Society for Cell Biology, and those will be pasted in the chat. Please keep comments respectful, constructive, collegial, and to the point. A few reminders: this call is being recorded and will be shared publicly. Closed captions are available, and we ask that you use the chat to contribute to the discussion and give a thumbs up to questions that you would like to see answered live by our keynote speaker and our panelists. During this 2-hour plenary event, we will hear opening remarks from Stephen Curry, DORA Chair. This will be followed by a keynote address from Sarah DeRica and a Q&A. After a 10-minute break, we'll move on to the second half of our program, a panel discussion with experts from around the world, where we'll hear about their experiences with and aspirations for responsible research assessment. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Curry, Chair of DORA. Stephen is a professor of structural biology at Imperial College London, where he wears many hats. He has served as Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Life Sciences and is also the Associate Provost of Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion. In addition to his tireless efforts to support DORA, Stephen is a passionate advocate for equity and responsible research assessment in academia and has spoken and written extensively on these topics. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Haley. And let me just share my screen and my slides. And here we go. And slideshow. And so good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. It's an enormous pleasure to be introducing and making some opening remarks at our American, African, and European plenary. This is a great day for DORA, although in some ways, of course, in an ideal world, we wouldn't be celebrating DORA's 10th anniversary because the job would be done. But DORA is very well aware that we live in the real world and we have to deal with real people. And so the work still has to go on. So I just want to make some short remarks about where DORA came from and talk about some of the work that we have done very briefly, and then look ahead to what is in store for DORA's future. So DORA is 10 officially today, but that is our public birthday. The declaration itself was born actually at a rather hastily convened meeting at the ASCB, the American Society for Cell Biology meeting in San Francisco in December 2012, when a group of editors and publishers and members of learned societies got together to discuss what to do about the intrusion of the particularly aggregate metrics such as the journal impact factor into the processes of research assessment. This was a sort of change in our culture and in our incentive mechanisms that nobody had designed, but it was increasingly seen that we had been drifting into a status quo that was becoming increasingly unhealthy for science and for scientists and for scholars of all sorts. And so that meeting, which took place in 2012, and we still actually have the minutes of that meeting, was reflecting a much wider conversation that had started, much earlier. This is an editorial from PLOS Medicine from 2006, looking back at looking at the problem of impact factors. And I myself, actually, on my blog, which I started in 2008, had sort of started writing and obsessing a little bit about the problematic nature of the misuse of impact factors in research assessment. So eventually the DORA declaration was drafted as a result of this meeting, I think, and I want to pay particular tribute to people like Stefano Bertuzzi, who was the chief executive of the ASCB at the time, but also Mark Patterson, Bernd Pulverer, and many others who were there very much at the beginning. I myself was not present at this meeting and was not at all involved in DORA at the time. I just got wind of it, thanks to Mark, just shortly before publication. But it was I think DORA embodies the aspirations of very passionate and motivated group of people, and although many of those original founders have moved on from DORA, we have managed to sort of continue to win allies and advocates, and we still have a very active steering group working for us today. So the declaration was eventually published in 2013, May 16th, 2013. And of course, as many people will be well aware, the primary focus is on advocating not for people not to use journal-based metrics such as the impact factor as a measure of the quality of individual research articles or even indeed individual researchers. What is still perhaps less well known is that the declaration goes on in some detail to spell out very positive recommendations for actions to be taken by different stakeholders, such as research institutions, funders, data providers, publishers, and of course researchers themselves, into how they could go about transforming and rethinking research assessment and introducing a much healthier and more holistic approach. Now, in the years following 2013, I was certainly one of the early advocates, as were many other people, but there was a certain degree of frustration built up because DORA very much relied on volunteer efforts back then. We were indebted and are still indebted to the good offices of the ASCB for helping to set up and run the website, but there was no funding behind the organization. And so it was, oh dear. While it attracted a great deal of attention, I don't think it was winning quite the hearts and minds in the way that the founders had wanted it to do. And I remember discussing it at this meeting at the Royal Society in London in 2015. I was very much advocating for DORA and talking to lots of people about it, but there was a shared frustration that it really wasn't getting the purchase that it deserved. And I remember writing to Mark Patterson, and this is an email I dredged up back from February 2015, asking, who's leading on DORA, what's happening. It's very hard to find on Google because, of course, it sort of overlaps with DORA the Explorer. And I just was sort of trying to advocate for a more organized push. And so as a result of that, there was a number of us sort of at that meeting and sort of meeting online with Bernd Pulverer and Mark and various other members of the steering committee. We managed to sort of bring together then a group of initial supporters. And so we managed to get together some funding. And with that funding, we were then able to appoint our very first program director, Anna Hatch. And things then really started to take off, shall we say, for DORA. So we are very grateful to our current list of supporting organizations who help fund the operations that DORA runs. We're still a very small organization. We have 2 full-time members of staff and 2 part-time policy associates who do an enormous amount and to whom we are tremendously indebted. But we have moved on. We have a slightly whizzier website these days, which is become a much richer resource of information and experience. And that has really been helping to drive the conversation on responsible research assessment since that time. So this is a timeline which shows the sort of activities, and this is not all of the activities, and I'm not even going to go through all of the particular points mentioned here. But following the initial publication of DORA, there was a lot of talking and words about DORA, but not necessarily much action. And it was only really then when we managed to cobble together funding in 2017 that then there was a great deal more proactivity that continues to this day. And a couple of important points that I just really want to draw out of this timeline are the importance of bringing on board good people and having good people who can devote themselves full time. Oh, sorry, my mouse is really sensitive. So Anna Hatch, I've already mentioned, was our first program director, and then Hayley Hazlitt was appointed program manager in mid 2021. And Anna and Hayley have really been absolute stalwarts in helping to run and indeed create the DORA machine that has had such impact. And one other thing is the fact that we really recognize that the problem of research assessment is a worldwide problem and has to bring worldwide perspectives to addressing and creating solutions. And so one of the first things that we did following 2017 was to bring together an international advisory board, and that brought us a really important perspective. DORA had until that point been rather dominated by European and North American perspectives, but we brought in representatives from all over the globe, and that was extremely valuable for us, and so valuable, in fact, that we've actually updated our governance at the beginning of last year to make sure that actually that power was shared equally across our representatives across the globe. And so we actually merged the steering committee and the advisory board. And so our steering committee now really does have truly global representation. And that has really helped to enrich, our perspective and the way that we approach and interact with research and scholarly communities around the world. So this is the current makeup of DORA, the organization. So we are grateful to our very small staff. Anna has moved on at the end of last year to a new post at the HHMI, and will shortly be announcing the appointment of a new program director. But Haley has been absolutely superb as an interim director, and we're grateful to Queen and Sudeepa for all the efforts that they have made, but also particularly to all of our global representatives from around the world. I won't go through all of the names here in the interest of time. So following 2017, when we managed to accrue or gather in some funding, we set out DORA's first sort of strategic plan, and that had three elements. One, to promote the declaration, to get more signatories and raise more awareness about it around the world. To extend not just global impact, but also across disciplines. So DORA very much had its origins in the cell and molecular biology community, but the issues that it is addressing clearly impact all scholarly disciplines. And then the third, and to my mind, the most important one, pillar is about developing and promoting best practice. DORA is not about just being a piece of paper telling people what they should or shouldn't do with certain aggregate metrics, but it's about working with the community. And that, to me, is one of the great values of DORA, is the way that it is a people-centered organization, and one that is ready to roll up its sleeves and collaborate with people all over the world in order to try and figure out the best ways to reform research assessment. So we have worked very hard over those years to develop and promote good practice. We've collaborated with many other organizations to try and do some of this work, but we've also gone out and searched for good practice and good initiatives and brilliant ideas that have been developed by other organizations and other institutions to try and bring them together, and they are collected and curated in our extensive and growing resource library. But in the last 5 or 6 years or so, we have been engaged in many different activities. We've produced, short, concise briefings that we hope will punch through to the C-suite in many research institutions. We've written articles, we've created webinars, run conferences, and run workshops at other people's conferences. We have our resource library. We've started gathering, and this is one of our collaborations with the European Universities Association and Spark Europe, case studies of institutions that have signed DORA and actually then worked through the implementation, because I think it's important that we illuminate paths that have been trodden and that have been proved to be successful. We've given out community grants to stimulate work at ground level, and worked collaboratively with many other organizations, for example, the Royal Society with the Wellcome Trust, and various others around the world on policy development and tools development. TARA being the most recent one, which I'll mention very much at the end. So just one thing I really want to highlight, and this is maybe a personal hobby horse of mine, but I think one of the most important tools that DORA has advocated for. Certainly not one that we invented, because I think the idea had been circulating for a long time, but we'd be very keen on promoting it, because one of the criticisms that DORA receives is, well, if I can't use impact factors, what can I do in order to do sort of selection of candidates for recruitment or promotion, or for funding? I can't be expected to read all the papers, which is not something that DORA ever said you were supposed to do, or even would imagine would be capable of doing at scale. But the narrative or evidence-based CV, I think, and DORA thinks, is something that provides a workable tool that is actually time efficient, and it does recognize the pressures that many assessors are under. It's concise, it's values-based, and those values can be determined by you, by your organization, and they will vary depending on what type of research organization you see yourself as, or what type of funder you see yourself as, or what type of society or community you're aiming to serve. It can be structured then to address those particular values, to recognize the particular contributions that you deem to be most valuable. And having that structure then facilitates comparison. And I don't think we want to underestimate the difficulty always of making comparisons when doing research assessment, even within the same discipline, because it's often very difficult even to judge one research proposal versus another, for example. They are evidence-based. It's not just a story. They do admit quantitative information, and particularly if it can be placed into meaningful context. It is by no means a silver bullet, and this tool has to be developed and used with care. And we ran a workshop a couple of years ago to look at some of the pitfalls that might arise. And we know that many funders and organizations around the world that have adopted this format are themselves evaluating and reporting on their experience. And so this is very much an interesting and rising curve. One final thing just to highlight is Project Tara, which has been running for a couple of years now. And again, this is very much evidence of DORA's willingness to sort of get into the practicalities of understanding the issues and figuring out the problems. And so there will be 3 particular outputs from this, and they're already starting to come through. One is an interactive dashboard, which will help people to discover the implementation and uptake of responsible research assessment practices worldwide. And we hope to be able to launch the first version of that later this year. We're also conducting a survey of US institutions to understand their approaches to research assessment reform. And actually the first preprint discussing that survey was published just yesterday, and that was work led by Sarah DeRuyka and Alex Rushforth at the CWTS. And I imagine Sarah might talk about that in her keynote. And as then from the learnings that we get from both of those elements of work, we will expand the toolkit of resources in order to highlight and focus attention on best practice. So the work goes on. If we look back over the 10 years, we can see that there are many reports and initiatives and organizations that have either been inspired by DORA or have developed important ideas in parallel that very much align with DORA's aspirations. But one can see a sort of a thread all the way through these various different initiatives since 2013. And what we see here is a movement that really has spread around the world. I'm not trying to insinuate here that DORA is responsible and at the origin of all these movements, but it is one, I guess it is the one international organization that really has helped to sort of catalyze the uptake of these conversations and make sure that this is an issue that is really taken seriously around the world. And what we see sort of tracing through all of these different and collaborative and aligned efforts is the development of a worldwide movement. And so I don't, when we look back, the world was very different in May 2013 than it is today. I think the Overton window has definitely shifted. There is I think a worldwide acceptance that we are dealing with an important problem, and it is one that we really have to deal with. And But at the same time, of course, you have to recognize the enormous complexity that is going on here. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why DORA is still around after 10 years. But research assessment reform, which of course is the primary focus of DORA, is something that interacts with many other important aspects of research culture. One being, of course, open scholarship, which is a movement that has, I guess, born of the open access movement, which is itself more than 20 or 25 years old. And I guess more recently, then the drive within the academy to address some of the long-standing inequities that we see. And so we understand that, these are complex conversations, but again, one of the strengths of DORA, I think, has always been our openness to dialogue and conversation and debate about how we address these interlocking and intersecting challenges together as a community. So we will be carrying on, and we have just published our next strategic plan back in March of this year. We will continue to work to increase awareness of the negative impacts of using aggregate metrics such as the impact factor, but the H-index is equally problematic, I think, to say, in our view. We will continue our focus on the work to accelerate the development of clear and concrete measures to reform research assessment. And again, that will be a community and collaborative effort. We want to support advocates worldwide. And in a practical sense, we will actually be seeking to maintain the funding so that the stalwarts like Anna and Haley can continue to do the brilliant work that they do. And talking about brilliant people, then Atul Gawande, I think, is one of my sort of scientific and literary heroes. And this quote really has stayed with me, and I think is very pertinent to the issues that we are still discussing today. Yes, we would like frictionless technological solutions to the problem of research assessment, but I don't think such simple-made oven-ready solutions are really there for the taking. It's really people talking to people is still how the world's standards change. And I have to say, being part of DORA is one of the things that I am most proud of in my academic career. It has been a source of tremendous pleasure and tremendous satisfaction to see how the conversation, how the people talking to people really has developed over those 10 years. And that is all I am going to say for my introduction, but I will continue the theme of people talking to people, because what I would like to do now is introduce our keynote speaker. And our keynote speaker today is Professor Sarah Daraika. And Sarah is a professor in Science, Technology and Innovation Studies at the Center for Science and Technology Studies, or better known as the CWTS, at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where she has worked since 2011. Sarah specializes in social studies of research evaluation and has published widely and, may I say, brilliantly on the topic of interactions between science, governance, incentive structures, and knowledge creation in various different fields. She has a truly international reputation in this area. If I were to list all her accolades and contributions, it would leave no time for her keynote talk. So let me just mention briefly that she is the scientific director at the CWTS. She's also a co-chair of the Research on Research Institute. She represented the Netherlands in a high-level UNESCO expert group that produced an influential global recommendations on open science in 2021. She's also co-author of the Leiden Manifesto, and she is a friend and collaborator of DORA, a big part of Project Tara. I couldn't think of anyone better to be our keynote speaker for today, and so I'm absolutely delighted that she is here, and I would invite you, Sarah, please, to commence your lecture.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'll share my screen. And you should really, you're right to be very proud of all DORA's accomplishments thus far. We're looking back, but we're also looking ahead. So this is a talk about the future of research evaluation. And clearly, that is something that we are making together. So I would actually like to start with some acknowledgements. What I will present today was informed by work that I've been doing and I'm still doing alongside great colleagues at different institutions, including Tracy Elliott, who's senior consultant at the International Science Council, also the current and also former team members of DORA, Stephen and Haley and Anna Hatch, that Stephen already mentioned, was the previous DORA program director. Last but certainly not least, also Ruth Schmidt and Alex Rochforth, who are collaborators in Project Terra, that I will indeed also present some findings on. But first, a little anecdote, I guess. This is, of course, a celebration of DORA's 10th anniversary, which made me think back of a couple of things the past decade. For me, that includes looking back at the paper that I helped author in 2015. That is often kind of co-cited alongside DORA, the declaration, and that's the Leiden Manifesto that Stephen also mentioned. So since 2015, I'm also giving talks about responsible metrics uses in the context of assessments. And in these talks, I also sometimes draw on the 9th principle of the Leiden Manifesto, which is to recognize the systemic effects of assessment and indicators. And it's about the fact that indicators change the system through the assessments and the incentives that they establish, and that we should continue to anticipate these effects, and we should carefully scrutinize them. When I give those types of talks, I also often make the point about that the science system is very complex. Stephen also mentioned the complexity of the issue and one of the reasons why DORA is still kind of around. It's a complex social system with people in it that have certain wants and needs. One of the points that some of us in this space are then making is that we need all stakeholders to align and to get behind this agenda, including researchers and universities and funders and publishers and learned societies. And that we need those to move forward. And then I usually say that change is hard, but that it's really worth it. And every now and then, someone then comes up to me afterward with their own ideas of the current state of play, basically, in research assessment. Most of the time, it's someone who wants to persuade me that I'm on a mission impossible, that this is not a doable agenda because metrics are everywhere, because AI, because publishers, or because rankings, or because China. And after such an exchange, I usually tell myself, okay, chin up, keep going, be patient. Change is coming. We're celebrating that change today. So I think it's really true. But I also get tired of these kind of interactions sometimes, I must admit. But then something happened last week, and that was very different. Last week, the dean of a college in the US came up to me after my talk. But instead of us basically ending up in a relatively familiar territory, the conversation went into a different direction because they said basically, look, I get that change is hard. And I get that is also your job to tell me about complex social systems, but is it not very simple? What if we would all simply start at our own institutions? Because we can really fix this if we all affect change locally. That was my facial expression. I was shocked, I was surprised. It's not what usually happens. And after a couple of seconds, I realized that I'd come across a very specific type of individual, a type of person that rarely comes up to the stage after a talk because they're too busy doing other things. They're trying to affect change. So this is, I guess, a type of person that we refer to in this report as an exemplar. You're looking at the cover of a report that was commissioned by the Inter-Academy Partnership, by the Global Young Academy, International Science Council. So 3 major global international organizations who represent national, senior and young academies, early career academics, scientific unions, learned societies, and some national research ministries and funding agencies. And that paper was co-authored by members of a scoping group, a team of experts from across the globe, which worked intermittently between May 2021 and February of this year to produce this discussion paper. And the idea of the group was to take stock of the challenges and debates and developments in research evaluation worldwide and also across different research cultures and systems. And I guess one of the key purposes of the report is that it addresses and also tries to mobilize people of the 3 major international organizations, elite organizations in a sense, and also their respective members as agents of change. And some of these members, like the dean that came up to me, are or can be exemplars. They can change their own institutional culture, refresh their membership, awards, publishing and conferencing practices, and also leading by example. Other members may be more like some of you in the audience today. They are or can become advocates of reform, raising awareness of research assessment debates and developments and reforms in recognition that their members serve as, for instance, mentors and supervisors of junior colleagues, also serve as leaders of higher education institutions or board members of funding and publishing governance bodies and advisors to policymakers. Others still, like some of you, will or can become innovators, exploring different approaches to valuing basic and applied research in inclusive and innovative ways. The report also points out, it's not the first to do so, but it's important to continue to do so, what role funders and publishers and evaluators can play. And the last category, the evaluators, can capitalize on the role of members at both institutional and also individual levels, whose business it is to evaluate researchers and research in institutions, and those who have publishing and editorial and also peer review roles. And it also stresses that collectively acting as collaborators, the organizations can support already established campaigns for reform, including DORA. DORA figures prominently in the report. It was published as an inaugural event of the ISC Center for Science Futures last week. It will be jointly launched this week by the 3 organizations, and it's already downloadable at the website of the Center for Science Futures and with this QR code for those interested. And it also describes in some detail, actually, again, maybe in a sense, reasons for the need for assessment reform. And to describe that again continues to be necessary because some of the points are unfortunately not agreed on by everyone and are still contentious sometimes. So it's not agreed on by everyone that we need assessment reform to maintain research quality and to protect research integrity. And it's also not agreed on by everyone that we need assessment reform to maximize inclusion and diversity, unfortunately. It's also not agreed on by everyone that we need assessment reform to optimize research as a global common good. And a fourth reason for providing really clear rationales for reform to certain audiences is because of the last reason mentioned on the slide, and that is to respond to a fast changing world. So, of course, these that point is also referring back to that point that I made about the systemic effect of indicators and to the need to revisit them regularly. This applies to the entire science system and to the entire organization of the assessment system as well. Because of the world changing, we need to, at some point, reconsider the reasons for doing assessment in this case in a particular way. So current developments that require us to reconsider assessment systems include, of course, the transition to open science, also the increasing use of technology in this context, including AI, and the rise of social media. Let's focus on the first two. So the open science movement that also requires reform of research evaluation to improve openness and transparency. That is, for instance, because many of the metrics and indicators used to measure research performance are themselves not transparent, frequently calculated behind closed commercial doors. And that lack of transparency compromises also the autonomy of research communities. It restricts options for evaluating and testing and verifying and improving indicators. Responsible research assessment is becoming a core aspect of global moves towards open science, as we can, for instance, see in the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which also includes the development of an open science toolkit for its members to help them really review and also reform their research career assessments and evaluation criteria. The other thing is the technological advances in AI and machine learning, which will probably have profound consequences for research evaluation, including the peer review processes supporting it. It's already being used to streamline and strengthen peer review, to test the quality of peer review, to test the quality of citations, to detect plagiarism, or also to catch researchers doctoring data and to find peer reviewers. It's important to realize that all forms of AI and machine learning are open to abuse, and that research communities will need to build preparedness and resilience to this, alongside government and industry and civil society leadership that are also governing this space. So when we look at reform movements globally, much momentum is actually currently coming from Europe, perhaps with the exception, of course, of global actors like DORA and like UNESCO, and some really important regional actors who have also championed research assessment reform. And if signing DORA can be seen as an indicator in itself of impact of the responsible metrics movement, then we would have to conclude that this movement didn't yet have a lot of impact in the context of the US. This is something that we're exploring in that DORA project that I have here on the screen. Only 2 academic research performance institutes had signed DORA in February, only 4 academic departments and 3 university libraries, which raises the question of why is this the case? It's not really a lot, even or especially considering that DORA is indeed 10 years old, considering that smaller research systems like the UK and also my own country, the Netherlands, have really scores of academic institutes that have signed the declaration. There are reasons why that is maybe potentially a bit easier in a system like the UK or the Netherlands. We can talk about that, but still. So some of you may be familiar with Project DORA, tools to advance research assessments. It's led by DORA. Stephen already talked about it. It's funded by a 3-year grant from Arcadia. And as part of that project, my CWGS colleague Alex developed a survey together with the team of US institutions to also understand institutional attitudes and approaches to research assessment reform. And after that survey, we also held 18 in-depth interviews, which covered issues from respondents' awareness of responsible metrics campaigns, but also their uses of metrics in hiring, promotion, and tenure procedures, and to their views on the prospect of reforming these procedures in their institutes. So broadly speaking, we were interested in these questions. How do you as researchers or evaluators engage with the responsible metrics agenda, and how are notions of responsibility, like in the term responsible assessment, responsible metrics, how are they experienced and also practiced by specifically asking respondents the questions you see here on the slide. When is it appropriate to use bibliometrics? Is it? What are your professional obligations to use these tools responsibly? Do you recognize accounts of good or bad practice advanced within the responsible metrics reform movement? We can conclude tentatively, without trying to claim any level of generalizability, that there's not very strong familiarity amongst our US-based respondents with the language of responsible metrics. Informants rarely referenced specific points in responsible metrics statements, displayed a lack of awareness of who's behind the strong push for metrics. So nobody mentioned publishers, for instance. They also had a clear propensity to present their own bottom-up responsibilities, which were different from the response or the reform movement languages, or were similar only by coincidence, because people obviously inhabit the same professional world. So these bottom-up type of languages, they basically correspond with three types of responses to problems and solutions that were set out in the responsible metrics reform movements. And one of these, the strong endorsement one, largely agreed with the framing of the problems, while the two other responses, moderate alignment and pragmatic rejection, were more ambivalent. And I'll give you some quotes of the interviews that correspond with these three types of approaches. So this is the strong endorsement one. I would shut it down if someone on their CV wrote it, the GIF. I, needless to say, have to write a lot of letters for promotions, and I will see that on people's CV. I've never seen anyone, none of my faculty have ever put that on their CV, and I would have it removed. This is the kind of thing where I go back to them before we send the stuff out and say, take that off. So that is a respondent that clearly signals that they are a responsible agent who takes it as their job as a senior academic to challenge and also, well, really go against the use of inappropriate indicators when encountered. After reading out a section in the DORA statement calling for abandoning the GIFs, this interviewee responds, yeah, exactly. I would say that that is in line with what I was saying, although, you know, we like the difference is that if the impact factor, if it's there and noteworthy, we would say something about it, but we don't base the assessment on that. So that is a response that is representative of accounts that didn't fully subscribe to the problems with certain metrics. And several respondents really firmly argued against any notion that assessments were skewed toward metrics, arguing that they appear in certain parts of the decision-making process, but that they do so alongside other considerations and do not dominate the assessment. Now, the final one, the pragmatic rejection, the core emphasis of that one is on the need to live with the imperfections of the indicators. So this respondent says, I think for the most part, people kind of begrudgingly are okay with it, in the sense that, you know, it may not be the best, but it's probably the best alternative we have. So if there were other alternatives or things, you know, maybe some of the types of metrics that we've talked about that gain more traction, and maybe they could gain some momentum. But otherwise, I'd say that people are kind of, this is the kind of the way we've done it, and it's worked out okay. So we're just going to keep going down that path. So in this working paper that we have out now on this work, we kind of conclude that it seems that amongst our respondents in this relatively small scale study in the US, that the responsible metrics agenda is not that visible. Even when presented with information on reform movements like DORA, the respondents still had a very different narrative around indicators than the ways that they are framed in the movement. So a conclusion we could draw from this is that on its own, raising awareness and providing further information on the technical limitations on indicators or better alternatives is not enough for mainstreaming this agenda. Well, given that reform movements have an international or at least a large regional focus, we hope that that kind of study that we did here provides us with a useful blueprint for further research on assessment reform elsewhere, and that it also stirs some debate potentially and discussions within reform movements. After that slightly more depressing news maybe about the current uptake of the responsible metrics movement in the US, we should also, of course, acknowledge that there are very interesting new developments in the US as well, including the Helios Initiative, the Higher Education Leadership Initiative for Open Scholarship, which also has several working groups making interesting progress. And I think one of them actually looks at how campus leaders can be engaged in discussions around how to align and also, especially align, I guess, hiring and reappointment and tenure and promotion decisions with institutional values. One of the efforts that we made in this discussion paper was also to provide additional regional overviews and national examples of experimentation and reform. There's a lot of great case studies also on the DORA website. These are additional because they are also trying to address some of the other regions. There are a lot of European examples out there. I don't have time to go over them all, but I'll pick one that inspired me. I invite you to look at the report online if you're interested. And that example is actually from China. China is now the most research productive country in the world. It's the second in terms of research investment. And of course, there's ample room to pick up threads from a more pessimistic discussion about China's governance model, politics, but this is a celebration. There are also developments in China that have the potential to affect real systemic change. And one of them is that over the past 5 years, China's largest funding agency for basic research, the National Natural Science Foundation of China, has actually carried out systemic reforms to reflect important shifts in the science system, including the importance of transdisciplinarity, the combination of applied and basic research, the interplay between research and innovation. It's moving away from bibliometrics to a system that actually also tries to strengthen other forms of relevance, local relevance of research. It has improved its peer review system so that it better fits curiosity-driven disruptive research, high-quality science applied to economic and social demands, or transdisciplinary research dealing with grand challenges. And as of 2021, 85% of the proposals were submitted and reviewed using these new categories. And in November last year, the NSFC announced a 2-year pilot reform plan for talent evaluation, in which it also engaged 8 ministries and 12 research institutes, 9 universities and 6 local governments. The NSFC is clearly an innovator. That's very encouraging. We need funders to explicitly recognize a wider range of outputs and activities in research assessment. That's a really important step towards a less toxic, less hyper-competitive research culture, toward a more sustainable research system where researchers' well-being is taken into account and also in which barriers are removed for underrepresented groups. And that's what needs to happen. In part of that change must be led by funders because as Stephen and I and others also wrote in the JRC report, they have more leeway than researchers in universities and journals who also really came to rely or had to come to rely on metrics for survival sometimes. This is a culture change that DORA, of course, as a reform movement, is also very actively contributing to. So that's what we're celebrating today. We celebrate how DORA has, over the past 10 years, built a movement and a community. That community still has a lot of work carved out for itself. That community, of course, includes all of you. It includes me. And the question I would like to end with is, what can you do, or what can you do more of to get people to move from pragmatic rejection to strong endorsement of responsible assessment system? I hope that today we can surprise and also wow each other with good practices that help overcome structural barriers in the science system, so that in 10 years' time, that dean that approached me last week will represent the rule and not the exception. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was absolutely wonderful. Full of insight and information, as we were expecting. Let me, we have a little bit of time for questions. We're going to move into a break shortly, but let me try and ask an interlinked question, which I hope isn't too complicated. But you mentioned early in your talk about hope for a consensus around this, and clearly there is a shifting conversation around the world, but your study in the United States shows that clearly there is quite a plurality or spectrum of views and opinions with regard to the utility or not of different metrics. But so firstly, do we need a consensus? Have revolutionary movements in the past really waited for a consensus before driving for change? And if not, then given what you've learned in the United States, and having said that, awareness is not enough, then what more can organizations like DORA do then to help shift that conversation, or maybe even build towards a consensus?
No, thank you. It's one of the things that I think is a discussion at all levels, like at the global, regional, national, and also local level. Moving forward and building responsible assessment systems. Some things are evidently bad practice, and some things are evidently a better practice. That doesn't mean that everyone will agree with the, for instance, the academic consensus on, for instance, the problems with using certain simplistic measures and metrics in assessment systems that are clearly bad practice. So it's a consensus in some corners, but not in all corners. So there won't be an overall consensus, I guess. But there will be kind of, well, from my point of view, proven good practices moving forward that we should try to include and move forward. And one of the things that I think, or three things I think should happen in tandem, and I think DORA is contributing on all three levels at the moment, and I hope they can continue to do so. It's in understanding, so better understanding, asking questions about what works and what doesn't, and as we've done with the US context, or we started to explore what's going on there. Why isn't DORA gaining traction visibly? But also, so understanding, but also intervening in concrete practices using the evidence that is available out there in collaboration with all the experts in the room here and in your wider networks. And also practicing what you preach. So I think it's, as an organization, also living up to the values that we propagate in the wider research culture landscape, and of course in the more narrow sense also in how you and your team work together and collaborate, and how you set an example from within as well.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Hilde Janssens in the chat. What do you mean by China being the most productive, the most research productive country? How was that measured?
The details are in the report that we draw on existing research on in this case output productivity, if I remember correctly. So there are references in the report that you can look up that will provide more information. So it's backed up by scientific evidence, looking at the classic productivity indicators around output.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask one final question, and then we'll move to the break. I mean, one of the things I hear sometimes when discussing these issues is that, people want to be told, what's the answer, what's the alternative. You mentioned that one of your American respondents said, the GIF was the best alternative we had, but people want, but in your experience, and perhaps with your social scientist hat on, do people really want just to be told what to do? I mean, I think autonomy is a really important facet of the sort of academic experience. So what's the answer to that conundrum? Should we just provide the answer? And what is the answer?
What is the answer?
Well, it's expressed variously. This morning I heard it expressed as well, a basket of metrics, but that was an undefined basket of metrics. So.
Yeah, this is maybe the anthropologist. I wasn't trained as an anthropologist, but I do a lot of kind of field work and have an inclination to an ethnographically informed answer here that would look at in which context and by whom, with what types of interest is that question asked. So there's not an overarching answer, I'm sorry to say. But if someone says basket of metrics, I hear someone quoting an Elsevier approach, but that may be not a mischaracterization of what's going on. I think what I also mean with an ethnographic inclination is that you really take seriously the concern expressed systematically when people say, okay, we know this it may be not the best practice, but we have time constraints. Those are legitimate concerns, but there's not a general overarching good answer to how this should be fixed, because it is really dependent on the context and the type of assessment. Is it a funder? Is it a university? Is it an institute? Is it an individual assessment? And what are the stakes? And what's at stake right now? Is it open science or not? So it really depends a little bit on those types of stakes and interests, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you once again for a brilliant keynote, giving us much food for thought. Can I invite everybody? I know the limitation of Zoom is you can't actually really applaud, but can we applaud electronically or using the clap emoji in the reactions so that we can show our appreciation for Sarah's wonderful lecture. So thank you very much. And we are going to proceed now to a short break. Haley, maybe I can invite you to guide me as to when we should restart. We're running a little bit behind schedule, but maybe we should restart at 10 minutes past, no.
I think 5 minutes past the hour.
5 minutes past the hour. Okay, so we're now going to play a short video from various people about what DORA means to me. And we will rejoin at 5 minutes past the hour. So thank you very much, everybody.
I've been part of the DORA initiative since right from the start, when a handful of us sat down a decade ago to agree on 3 notions: that the journal impact factor was being systematically misused for research assessment, that GIF was a single feature that could be changed with great effect and without having to redesign the whole scientific process, and that this was a systemic issue that involved equally all stakeholders: journals, funders, research institutions, and the community. We thus addressed specific recommendations for each of these groups in the declaration. For me, DORA focused attention on a key underappreciated topic at the time: how can we attain an informed, fair research assessment process based on a more diverse, meaningful set of criteria than misleading proxy metrics. DORA has played a part in convincing many to view bibliometrics in a more nuanced way and to apply them more thoughtfully, if at all. With fierce competition for resources, the topic is more relevant than ever. The proliferation of research integrity issues is just one warning sign of a system under strain. I think DORA remains influential because it offers practical advice and realistic suggestions. It's remarkable that after a decade, the misuse of GIF remains a live issue to be solved.
Hello, I'm Anna Hatch, and to me, DORA means that the scholarly community cares deeply about the ways we make decisions about who gets to conduct research. And it's more than that. It means that there are tens of thousands of individuals and organizations around the world that are working to de-emphasize journal prestige and value a wider range of researcher contributions in order to promote a healthy academic ecosystem. And by sharing experiences of these individuals and organizations working to improve the ways that research is assessed and facilitating dialogue and developing resources, DORA shows us that progress is made when we work together.
For me, DORA means taking an ambitious aspiration to reform research assessment and looking at practical ways to make that happen. This includes raising awareness of new tools and processes in research assessment, responsible use of metrics, and developing new policies and practices for hiring, promotion, and funding decisions. There are still lots of challenges ahead, but 10 years of DORA has seen global efforts across scholarly disciplines for fair and more equitable research assessment. Happy birthday, DORA!
To me, DORA is the concrete expression of what was previously just a set of principles around research assessment. It's become a global coalition and an innovative organisation that has passionate volunteers and staff that has been able to lead the debate in research assessment, develop concrete resources to help move research assessment forward, and has great convening power. It's become a global force in thinking about the future of research assessment, and I believe it's done so in a way that will benefit researchers, the academic community more widely, funders, and indeed the global public.
To me, DORA is a kind of support. 10 years ago, when China was in preparation of reforming the publication-dominated quantitative assessment, DORA, the declaration, came to birth, and it inspired and supported us a lot. Since then, I'm glad that our practices became part of DORA's global initiative, and I hope in the future our practices will contribute more to DORA.
For me, DORA means that better research can be achieved by assessing researchers and research on its own merit through a broad range of activities, collaborations, and possible outcomes. DORA also means a community of individuals and organizations interested in developing and promoting responsible research assessment practices through different tools and resources, case studies, community of practices, and engagement grants. DORA has been an inspiring initiative worldwide and a powerful laboratory for change in research assessment. Happy birthday, DORA.
What does DORA mean to me? In short, hope. Hope for a world where the practices of research assessment are constructed by people, for people. Hope that as a worldwide community, we can face the complexities of reform together. And hope that our reform efforts can create a research culture that is responsive to the needs and aspirations of all scholars. Right, it is 5 past the hour, so I'm going to welcome you back to the second half of our plenary session today. And so we are now moving to the panel discussion in which we hope to explore the present and future of responsible research assessment. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome to this session a very international panel, bringing their very international perspectives to it. These include, I'm going to get them to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail with our opening statements, but we have Andisa Mufengu from Cape Town in South Africa, Karen Strubantz, who is vice chair of COARA and is based in the UK, Judith Suits, who's actually a member of DORA's steering committee and is at the Universidad de la República in Uruguay, and Stephanie Warner from the University of Calgary in Canada. So we have representatives from North and South America and Europe and Africa on our panel. And so I'm going to invite each in turn initially to make a short opening statement. So can I start with you, Andisa, to introduce yourself and tell us what DORA means to you. Excuse me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. And yeah, hopefully the panel will live up to the expectations set by the keynote. I am a researcher and an academic at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And interestingly for me, previously I was a research librarian at the institution. And that's when I came across DORA when we were busy with promotions for academics and different things related to assessment. And from there on, that's when I actually took that up for my PhD. And literally, it was literally my baby for the past few years. And I looked at research assessment in the region and using my institution. And I think, so just an introduction of just how I came across DORA and how I've been involved in the different aspects happening around DORA. And I'll just also move on to maybe what DORA means to me. And I think the whole session has just got me thinking about maybe even things that I never thought of. The idea of hope, that kind of resonates with me. But I think for me personally, and also for my region of the world, which at times, I mean, I would not just speak for Africa, but maybe the global South broadly, it means context sensitive, it means equity, it means inclusive, it's open, it's transparent. And I think that's something also that was mentioned. It's flexible, it's transformative, it's responsive. I mean, that's asking for a lot, but wouldn't it be nice as a researcher to have something that can meet the needs of the scholars and also the individuals that are affected by the research and so on? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. So that's a great start. Karen Strubantz, can I invite you to make your opening statement?
Yes, definitely, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's very exciting to be here. So my name is Karen Strubantz, and as is mentioned, I'm invited with my head on as COARA Vice Chair, but I'm also a policy advisor, lead policy advisor for the Royal Society of Chemistry, a governing board member for Euroscience, and director of a small consultancy, culture-based consulting. And in all those capacities, it kind of all revolves around assessment and culture. So to kind of maybe say a bit more first about my journey, coming in a kind of career path where my entire portfolio revolves around these topics, and then I can maybe say something more personal about the connection with DORA. So I started, actually, I'm a chemist by background, and I started my PhD in Belgium at KU Leuven in 2010. And it's actually very early on in my PhD that I started to really ask questions around the research system and the assessment system, but also was introduced through a big European science policy conference, ESOF, in 2012, to the fact that actually people are working and doing research and really delving into some of these systemic issues. So I came across DORA and signed, I think, very early on. It must have been, I think, 2013. And it's then really had a big influence in the rest of my career, because I did initially continue my research in chemistry. I came to the UK, where I'm still based, in 2015 for a postdoc in Cambridge. But I started to, at that time, really kind of almost transition slowly to the world of science policy. And my first formal position as a policy advisor was at the Royal Society, where I think Stephen Curry had set the tone for conversations around this topic. But it was in 2018, they were running a big program on research culture. And one of my main achievements during my time there was actually the development of the resume for researchers that UKRI has then started to roll out. So that was really kind of bringing together a lot of my drive before for the topic, but also really delving into the research. We were then also working, I think DORA was invited to provide input to that, but also people from CWTS and also I remember Frank Miedema's team at the time as well from the Netherlands. And then the kind of big change, then the big involvement I've had is in 2022, I was invited to be part of the drafting team for the agreement on reforming research assessment, and then subsequently at the end of last year elected as vice chair of this new coalition in Europe that has very much built on DORA. What DORA means to me, I think it's been really an inspiration for me in setting me up to a career path. In my part of the world, I think it's inspired probably all the initiatives I've been involved in. It was already mentioned how DORA was kind of advocated for at the Royal Society several years before they then started to work on their Resume for Researcher and Culture program. But also I think COARA is very clearly building on the achievements and the momentum that DORA has created. And for me personally, I think it was in a time where I came across barriers and questions I had around the assessment system, and maybe didn't always find colleagues in my immediate environment who shared that I came across DORA, and it was really, it gave me a realization that other people were worried about this and that it was worthwhile pursuing to kind of try to drive change on this topic. So it's really been for me personally, an important part for me, but also an important part, I think, in Europe of setting all the momentum that is now, I think, picking up at quite a good speed if we look at the recent developments. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Karen. Great to hear that DORA is at least partly responsible for launching you on a very successful career. Judith, could I ask you to introduce yourself and make your opening statement?
Thank you, Stephen. Well, I am Uruguayan, and I have worked for 30 years in the University Research Council, which belongs to a public university that concentrates 80% of the country's knowledge production, a quite unique situation. The responsibility is huge. It is fair to state that what the University of the Republic does not undertake will probably not be undertaken elsewhere, and this is somehow true in all Latin American countries where public universities are responsible for the most part of research. The direction of research, the research agenda, is strongly influenced by the research evaluation system, so we can state that what is rewarded will define to a great extent what knowledge is produced. Can a country like Uruguay, or for that matter, any Latin American country, let the criteria of papers accepted by international journals be the guidance of national research? It is easy to say no, but given that academic evaluation is necessary, other indicators are needed. And here enters DORA, showing that first, the science governed by the current evaluation criteria is neither the better nor the most innovative. And we need the best and the most innovative research to fight the huge problems we face. And two, alternative indicators exist. They are workable, and DORA helps to introduce them. Having DORA give researchers in countries like ours support for demonstrating that research quality is not jeopardized but enhanced following responsible research assessment. Thank DORA for 10 years. And for the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. And finally, Stephanie, please, we'd invite you to give your opening statement and perspective from Calgary.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me on the panel today. It's really an honor to be in such esteemed company. My name's Stephanie Warner. I'm the manager of a team called Knowledge Engagement at the University of Calgary. Although I'm actually joining you from a conference in St. John's, Newfoundland right now, from the east coast of Canada, but the University of Calgary itself is located in Western Canada. I just want to take 1 second to acknowledge that the university is located on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda, as well as home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. My personal background is actually in cell biology, but I've worked in different university support roles since 2016. And since late 2021, I've been in this role in knowledge engagement and leading our efforts at the University of Calgary to implement the DORA recommendations. The University of Calgary is quite an impact-focused university. We're a fairly young university in Canada, and we take pride in being quite entrepreneurial and innovative and action-oriented in a lot of ways. So we were the first university in Canada to sign DORA, following our major Canadian funders. And to our knowledge, we're actually the most active in implementing the recommendations of DORA. We have a couple of full-time positions dedicated to research impact assessment and research assessment reform, which I think is quite a unique opportunity for our team. Other things I think that align really well with the DORA recommendations are our focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and truth and reconciliation in Indigenous contexts. So the recommendations of DORA really provide such a nice backdrop for fostering these discussions of what research excellence is. As I said, I'm quite new to this space and wasn't very aware of DORA before that. Having kind of gone through that academic landscape and acted as a career advisor for PhD students for a number of years before taking on this role, I actually think this aligns really well with a lot of my beliefs about the evolution of research culture and the way research has really changed over the years, even since I started my PhD in 2007, when really knowledge translation was just becoming a hot topic in health research, and just seeing how much that's changed, and the diversity of different types of research that are happening at the university, and that our systems haven't always reflected that diversity in terms of how tenure and promotion and appointment are structured. So I think within our team, knowledge engagement is a team that's focused on research impact more broadly. We do fostering community partnerships, knowledge mobilization, and now research impact assessment. So it's all fitting really nicely into the conversation. And the approach we've really taken is building on what Stephen was saying. It's very people focused. I think there is that view that, many people, when they hear of research reform, they want to know what to do instead. They're open to change, but if there's a clear path forward. And I think the value of this different approach is to be able to have those conversations and build capacity in research assessment and research assessment reform, and actually talk to different disciplines and different faculties and different career stages, and hear about what research excellence means to them, how transparent are criteria, how do they experience the system. So I think that this is just a really fabulous movement, and I think it's really growing in Canada. We're seeing a lot of momentum just beginning, and a lot of enthusiasm. So I look forward to hearing more from the panelists today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and well, congratulations on being the first Canadian university to sign the declaration. Are you hopeful that many others will follow your shining example?
There are many others now, I think, and we can talk more about this as we go. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, but I think there's still some barriers in terms of actually signing on, or some perceived barriers perhaps. But I will note that all of our major Canadian funders have signed and are kind of setting the stage for others.
Good. Okay, well, we'll maybe get to the topic of barriers in a moment, but I first want to ask just each of you, I mean, some of you have already alluded to it in your opening remarks, but from your perspective, what has DORA's impact been in your part of the world? And Disa, can I maybe turn to you first?
Thank you very much. I think that has been very interesting from an African perspective. I know, I mean, a lot of higher education institutions have been following the conversations. The funders have also been following the conversations and being involved in a lot of work But I think we haven't seen that translating to anything, especially from the university's perspective. I mean, my own university has set up working groups since 2019 or so, but we haven't seen the university committing. And I think generally for the continent, I even just looked again with the signatories, and there hasn't been actually any university. A lot of it is funders, research councils, and so on. And I think that could be for different reasons. I think a lot of it is the fact that institutions, they know that it can't be a tick box exercise, which a lot of things have been in the past, where institution goes and say, we commit, we will do this. But in essence, the practices, the structures and the systems don't change. They remain how they used to be in the past. But I think DORA is almost saying, raising those questions that you can't just sign. We will hold you to it as also researchers in that space. While I think for research councils, and maybe because of the level of complexity and maybe different faculties and so on, this was maybe a bit different, or maybe different structures. But I think for universities, I know with my institution, a lot of work has been conversations around it. How do we work around the values? What do we do? Do we just add a certain line in our promotion systems and say we commit, which in essence, that's not the case. It's more than just that. It's the structures. So there's been lots of conversations, lots of working groups. My own institution it has a working group that's working on a framework. But I think one, progress was from our national funder in South Africa, which did put together an impact framework, which also, it still comes back, what does that mean for the different researchers? Because then, in essence, I think from a structural perspective, it's a good document to make reference to, but the systems and the practices, one would argue differently. So I think it has raised lots of questions, and for institutions to interrogate their practices around assessment so that they can align with DORA. But we're hoping, we know the change is complex. We're hoping that some institutions, especially universities, can lead in the space. And we're hoping, we pride ourselves as the ranked #1 in the continent is University of Cape Town, that institutions can just jump in and lead in this space. And because I think the rest of the institutions, I can see them following when someone has almost gone into these uncharted waters and shown how it can be done. Is it easy? None of us think it is, but it can be done, certainly. So we're quite hopeful, but we understand it's a bit of a complicated one. It's not impossible. I think that's a lot of work that's been written about. It's not impossible, but very little progress currently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that's an important point. I think of all the different organizations that are invited to sign DORA, it is probably the most difficult challenge for universities, because ultimately they employ most researchers. And so I guess they do need to take the consequences seriously, although of course we would encourage them to jump on board as soon as they feel they are ready. Let me just have a note to our online audience, and there are more than 150 people in this room. So please do, if you have a question for the panel, please do post it in the chat. But let me turn now just to Karen, just to give me your short take on the impact in your part of the world, and you can maybe interpret, speaking with your COARA hat, you can maybe expand that from Belgium to the rest of Europe at least, or if not beyond.
Yes, definitely. So I think, Sarah touched already a bit on the fact that a lot of the momentum is now really in Europe around research assessment, and I do think DORA has played a really big role in that. There are, I think, many organizations, not only, but also universities in Europe who have signed, especially in some specific countries, who have been really progressing also within their national context. And I'm thinking specifically about the UK and the Netherlands, but also elsewhere in Europe. And actually, I think in the last years, there's also been, now with COARA, there's also been people who look at the two together, DORA and COARA. So I think that has also caused an uptick. But to go further back, I think DORA has been steering initiatives across Europe. So speaking maybe first with my hat on as a former policy team member at the Royal Society, I know when we were looking there at changes that I think have now really started to progress, change around the narrative CV in the UK, we involved DORA, I think you personally, Stephen Curry at the time, but also Anna Hatch in conversations around that. And equally now with COARA, it was very clear when the European Commission started to facilitate that piece of work that DORA was one of the pieces of work we were building on, and that were also important in the conversations with stakeholders from all different countries. And it provided an initial common language, because most of the stakeholders involved in those conversations were aware of DORA, were aware of the problems it pointed out. So we didn't really have to start from scratch there. We really already had a common document that not everyone maybe signed up to, but at least most people know about, and many had signed. So I think that was in that sense really a starting point for then further building on that. I must maybe add a few caveats, and one I think is that we have sometimes seen on Twitter that universities or other organizations are called out for not always, despite having signed, maybe following the practices that we would expect from a DORA signatory. So I'm not saying there's no work to do in this part of the world. I think there's a lot of work to do. As I said, the UK and the Netherlands are ahead in really kind of implementing new tools, but there's a lot of work to get others on board, or to also make sure that those tools are the right ones for everyone in Europe, and then to come also to COARA's ambitions to go beyond Europe. There's then kind of really big challenges of how we really make that also global, some of those commitments together probably with DORA, because I think the two will really they are starting to work more and more together, and I do see them as a continuation of building on that nice timeline, Stephen, that you showed, starting with DORA and with at the moment COARA there at the end. I hope there will be things to follow on that timeline, building on all that work that's going on. But I think, yeah, the common language is maybe the important point to take here, that I think has been important for more recent progress to build on.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. Let me turn now to Stephanie. I'm going to come to you, Judith, but I'm going to tag on to you a question that's appeared in the chat about the situation in Colombia, which is not Uruguay, but it's closer to you than it is to anybody else. So, Stephanie, what the impact of DORA in Canada? I mean, obviously, it has an impact in Calgary. Where else?
Yeah, and I think that. As I said, I think the conversation's really just ramping up. I feel like momentum is really building in the Canadian space, which is really quite exciting. So I think there's, as I mentioned, long been a focus on, knowledge mobilization, the importance of, considering research impact. I think that's only building. And I think DORA, as we've seen at the University of Calgary, it's really a great driver of change, because as Karen was saying, it does provide that common language and some key recommendations that cover a lot of ground. So we can tackle different parts of it in different ways. I mean, we can talk about, the challenges and, biases inherent with the journal impact factor, and that's a great lever in some spaces. In other spaces, they already don't use the journal impact factor. So it's a great opportunity to celebrate good practices already, or recognize some of our, research units that do really exciting community engaged research, and the types of, outputs and research processes that are inherent with that type of work, and how that might be different timelines and, different partners and different connections within that space. Just recognitions of different pathways to impact and what that might mean. It's allowing us to have discussions, and very open discussions, about what does impact mean? What does high quality mean in different disciplines and different faculties? So I think it's really provided a great framework, if you will, to dive into many different discussions that are around this same movement. So I think at the University of Calgary, that's been really a great opportunity to do this work. We also had a research impact assessment, or DORA, working group that was formed in late 2021, and was meeting to discuss things like, the DORA case studies, what other places were doing, what some of the common practices are in Canada. And I think using some of those Project Terra tools, things like that, has been a great impact. There is a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of curiosity. Once we had signed on, a lot of folks were mainly asking, okay, well, what do we have to do differently to comply? So there's been a lot of unpacking as well of the fact that this isn't like a checklist of compliance. It is more a movement and a building of a better system. And I think DORA's impact in the Canadian context more broadly, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the importance of our Canadian national funders. We have a suite of funders. Some of the primary ones are what we call the Tri-Council, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Canadian Foundation for Innovation, Genome Canada. So there's a large group of these national funders in different spaces. And they've also been collaborating very closely on their implementation of the DORA recommendations. So we are starting to see more and more funding competitions that are asking for broader research outputs, might be asking for a most significant contribution statement rather than just a traditional CV. There's a movement toward a kind of a refined CV that is more narrative in scope. And DORA is one of the main drivers of that change. So I really think that we're seeing a lot of things happening, and I'm excited to see where it continues to go. I think that we are still quite early in that movement in Canada, but it's happening quickly.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I mean, I think the point you make about the funders taking notice, I mean, that is an important factor, I think, in driving change. And I think that probably illustrates the reason why Karen was saying that in the UK and in the Netherlands there's been quite strong take-up, because I think a lot of that is funder-led or influenced by funder policies. I think the same is true in Switzerland as well. And so maybe that is a lever that might operate in other parts of the world as well. So Judith, let me come to you and talk about and tell us a little bit about what you think the impact of DORA is in your part of the world, and maybe in your answer you could address then the question that has been raised by Maria Alejandra Tejada Gomez, who's from Colombia, and says, we're very focused on the production of articles in Q1 and Q2 journals. I presume that means journals in the top 2 quartiles of impact factor or prestige. How can we make a programmatic transition to move to a better research culture? So from a South American perspective.
Well, the first thing I would like to say about DORA's impact has to do with legitimization, because DORA has legitimized the critique of the current research evaluation system. And this is fundamental, because without the prestige DORA conveys, it is easy to dismiss any critique, but accusing those who make them as second-rate researchers. So some critiques are well accepted. For instance, bad practices in science induced by quantitative biases, and some are not so accepted, like impoverishing of intellectual effort due to short-termism. But anyway, legitimization of critique is fundamental, because we are in developing countries and we used to measure ourselves against the North. And so if the only way of being good is to be like those that publish in those and those journals, we are simply tied hands without any possibility of change. So the legitimization of critique is fundamental, and this is the first impact I would say DORA has provided us as southern researchers. Second, it has inspired concrete alternative ways of conduct research evaluation. For instance, in my university, DORA's influence is already translated into practice. It is not allowed to assess the 5 years performance of faculty quantitatively. When the time comes to grant a new period, we don't have a tenure position. Every 5 years, we need to show what we have done, and then it is assessed, and we are or not granted 5 years more. So how do you avoid quantitative way of measuring. This required a qualitative and integral judgment of all the activities done. And this led to the provision of narratives of the task performed, instead of a list of papers with the age factor of the journals in which they have been published. And this start answering our Colombian colleague question. You can do that. You can ask for qualitative way of narrating what you have done. And the enrichment of the information is remarkable. Comments are made about the significance of the research. Descriptions of the research done explain why in some cases obtaining result is taking more time than usual. Personal circumstances find a place where to be highlighted, and this is also very important. And third, the third impact, I would say, is that the combination of critique and alternative is important for young researchers in developing countries, perhaps everywhere, that felt badly the unbearable pressure of publish or perish or apply or die. They want to be scientists of their country and scientists of the world. Responsible research assessment helps them to reconcile both aims, and we have to thank DORA for helping us to push this forward.
Thank you very much, Judith. And let me again encourage the audience to keep posting your questions in the chat. I just want to follow up actually on something that that Stephanie said. It sort of prompted a thought in my mind. You said that, you know, sort of part of DORA's impact had been to sort of create space for the conversation, and people were now asking, you know, what does impact really mean, and what does, you know, high quality research really look like? And I did wonder then, you know, these are the sorts of things that I guess we just absorb by osmosis in our research trajectories, you know, through our PhDs and postdocs and then research careers. So is, you know, do people think, and maybe Andisa, you know, as a more towards the early career end of the spectrum than myself, you know, is science of science, you know, should we be teaching these things formally as part of undergraduate programs, and might that then help to eliminate some barriers? Andisa, you got thoughts?
Thank you very much. I think that's an interesting question and a very important aspect to address, and especially with a lot of this happening in a higher education space. I think when I did my PhD, a big aspect was it when I spoke to early career researchers or younger researchers, a lot of it was that I will copy more or less what my professor's been doing. So in essence, it's what the norms and what is seen as being legitimate, without necessarily a professor saying this is how you should be doing this, you should be publishing and doing that. And of course, in essence, you've created a full research on how they should perform if you're going to be a professor by imitating certain practices, which at times we would argue they're not the best way. And they might not align with the values of the different researchers. And coming from my background as a librarian, I think the literacy and understanding has been a missing space. And I know earlier, Sarah spoke about the whole awareness that, I mean, it's not enough. I think we safely agree, whether it's from the early career researchers, pre-career or so on. The awareness, I think, is a big aspect, and I don't think we can take that for granted, but I think we've realized one needs to do more than just the awareness. One needs to train, one needs to build capacity in that space, which in the past, we probably assumed that maybe we all are on the same page. We understand the same language when we talk about assessment and what research means to contribute. But now we're realizing when we actually come years down the line, or someone has a whole career, we are not on the same page. And I think that aspect of creating awareness, capacity building, and whether it's literacy around this space, what it means, and groups sitting around and conceptualizing this, I think that's an aspect I think research support teams have been doing. I mean, libraries have been doing quite a lot, but I think this is a space where I think more work needs to go along with the efforts of DORA and so on. Thanks. Thank
you very much. I want to ask a question now that's come through from the floor. Actually, two very closely related questions around how best to support, advocates on the ground who are trying to push change either in their institution or in their area. So, what would you say, to an individual or team that, would encourage them or help them to keep moving forward, particularly if they are encountering many of the sort of institutional cultural barriers to change that we are familiar with? Karen, let me start with you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the first thing to say is it's not an easy question to answer, because I remember conversations with supervisors or people who are guiding me, where we were also looking between a balance of what is needed to progress in the direction in your career you want to, and how can you do that in a way that aligns with your values. And that's not always easy, especially in the current system. That being said, I do think there's a lot of small things that everyone can do. One example I always mention is changing the conversation. So in conversations I've been in, it's been so often that I've told someone I've published a piece of research, and the first question being asked would be, in which journal? That doesn't have to be the first question. We can change those conversations. We can ask what it was about or who it would have an impact on. So I think there are just small things in changing the culture that can help. And then, of course, many of us will progress into doing assessment ourselves. Often quite early on, we will be asked to do peer review or to have some head-on where we have a capacity of assessing. Those are also the moments, I think, to think about how we want to approach that within the boundaries that are available, obviously, but also to not be afraid to ask questions at that point, why we're doing things in a certain way. Because that can make others think as well. And being in a critical environment or in an environment where the assumption is that we're supposed to be critical, I've usually not been kind of shown on asking those kind of questions, even though they maybe didn't always immediately have the desired effect. But I think it's through constant conversation. And maybe it comes back to your quote from Atul Gawande, Stephen, that I think we can really see small steps, and those add up to big steps in the end.
Yes, I think day to day, that's a very important thought to hang on to. I mean, as we know, change in organizations and culture is very slow when you're living through it. But I think, in 100 years' time, I hope that people will look back and think, look, there was a revolution happened at the early part of the 21st century in the way that we conducted research assessment. Judith, what words of encouragement would you give to advocates in your part of the world who are struggling with resistance, shall we say?
Well, Stefan, this is a very difficult question, but we shouldn't be discouraged, because young people particularly, want to be useful. After the pandemic, it was absolutely great to see how people put everything aside. Consideration about publishing, about following their PhD, following their papers, everything was put aside because urgency to help was more important than that. And this is a lesson we shouldn't forget, because urgencies are all over the place, not only the pandemic, everything. So once you see how solidarity can be rewarding, you can build the idea that you shouldn't be punished for being solidaristic. You should be, I wouldn't say reward, but let me live my life in a solidaristic way with my society. Don't punish me because I didn't publish this or I didn't finish this in time. And I am not sure, really, that we have learned the lesson. I am afraid that we are coming back slowly to business as usual, but some memory of that is there. And I think that this is going to help us to understand that change in the reward academic system is possible, is necessary and doable. I hope we are working for that.
Thank you very much. Stephanie, what would your words of encouragement be to a local advocate who's hitting the buffers?
I think So I think some of the early efforts, I can't take credit for much of what happened in the early signing stage of our institution, but a lot of the conversation that I hear from other I guess, research administration staff. That's the conference I'm at this week, is the Canadian Association on Research Administration. We had a DORA workshop on Sunday. A lot of the conversation was around that there is enthusiasm for reform practices, but it's difficult to get resources dedicated or to have leadership sign on. So I think my words of encouragement would be to talk to departments, faculties, etc., to learn about what DORA is and what it can mean to folks, and kind of perhaps build some of that groundswell support for the opportunities that DORA provides to, as Judith was saying, as others have been saying, to think more broadly about what research excellence means, and not to see DORA as the the roadblock of having to change policy, but the opportunity to recognize what matters to us as a research society, as a research culture, to the broader society. So I think the words of encouragement would be to listen to the folks that are really enthusiastic about this, and also to listen to folks who are challenged by the idea of DORA, and to really understand where that's coming from. And again, I'm very people focused, so I think it's to have more conversations about this and really just bring it to the forefront, make it more visible, make it so that you can't not hear about DORA and research assessment reform, because I think that's really where change happens. Is you have to start with that awareness.
Thank you. And Lisa, can I turn to you now just for your own thoughts about words of encouragement, but maybe tied to another question that's come in from the chat, which I think relates back to a point that you made about pressure sensed in the global south about operating to a system whose rules were dictated by the global north. But university management is often concerned about ranking, and I think this is certainly something that we hear from colleagues in Africa and in South America, that they're coming under pressure perhaps from governments or funders to perform in these systems. And so, what's the best way to try and mount a resistance to that kind of thinking?
I think it's an interesting one. I mean, on the ground, we know researchers want this change, they want this reform, but in essence, all the rewards and the recognition is tied into these things that we're trying to change. I mean, I look in our institution, if that whole ranking of being top in Africa is a big thing, and there's money involved in that, funding from the West will go to that university that's number one in the continent. And of course, administrators, they want to keep that. And we get research subsidy. So the more we publish as an institution, the more subsidy we get from the government if we publish in those quartile 1 or 2, in essence, and that affords us the space, the infrastructure that we have. I think a lot of it has to be, I guess, approach from where the researchers say we want this and we're willing to do the work, but also that cannot stand on its own. We need also the funders, we need the institutions to say, well, you know what, this does not serve us, which I think we have to come to a point where we say these standards that are created in the West, they do not serve us. They don't serve the future that we want to see and the contribution that we want to have in our institutions. So for us to transform, it's important that the institutions dismantle and they take that decision to say, we're going to change how subsidies are linked. It's not going to be publishing in quartile 1 and quartile 2 journals. It's not going to be how many articles are published in whatever. It's going to be what contribution did those work have in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Uruguay, and things like that. That makes more sense. So it's that whole process and pathway to impact rather than the products approach, which I think we've had so many conversations. But I think for us as South Africa and just also the continent, it's going back to those philosophical, ontological assumptions that we have and how they influence even just knowledge creation, because it starts way before we talk about the whole assessment. So lots of work, very complicated, but I think it requires that commitment from both parties because then there's no one that wants to be punished for not aligning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andisa. That was extremely insightful. We've had a very rich conversation. We're into our last 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists one final question. So we have been sort of looking back and looking and trying to understand the present, but I do want to try and turn to the future now. And I mean, this is a horrible question, but what do you think that responsible research assessment will look like in 10 years' time? Or perhaps you can also frame it as, what do you hope that it might look like in 10 years' time? So Judith, maybe I can turn to you first.
Well, I would put my thought in perhaps 7 points. First, narrative have become the standard way of documenting research performance. Second, the way research problems are built is taken into account. Researchers are encouraged to spend time building research problems with non-academics, representatives of government, civil society, organized work. This is important because unearthing problems is a complicated task that needs the researcher's involvement, because without that, the many suffering of common people will continue to be invisible for research. And unearthing needs encouragement because it takes time, it's difficult, it must be recognized as a truly academic task. Third, ethical aspects of research are thoroughly assessed and researchers are asked to reflect upon those aspects. Fourth, a sound heterodoxy is rewarded. The power of mainstream scholars is diminished. Experimentation, in the sense of following uncertain path, is encouraged through an evaluation system that assesses processes, not only outcomes. Fifth, a vibrant international community of scholars will, through the common procedures of responsible research assessment, become free to set research agendas that address fundamental problems of our time, without any fear of being punished for choosing too difficult problems leading to a small harvest of papers. 6, much more women will enroll in and enjoy doing research because harmonization between work and life will be at last possible. And finally, everybody will find a place in the wonderful enterprise of research. Every talent, their difference notwithstanding, will be appreciated in their due value. I hope this will come in 10 years.
Oh my God, what a fantastic answer. I can see the other panelists are grinding their teeth and thinking, oh my, leave us something to say. but I'm afraid I am still going to turn to you. So Karen, please, your hopes or your vision for 10 years' time. Will DORA have wound itself up?
I mean, first of all, I just want to say I agree with probably everything Judith said, because there would be several points I would have made. So I'll try to kind of come to a few other things. So, I mean, first, just returning to the head I have on today of COARA Vice Chair, I do hope that part of the commitments or all of the commitments that are set out in COARA, that will have seen success for those. And just for those who are less familiar with it, the kind of 4 core ones are around recognizing broader contributions, having a more qualitative assessment, but then also moving away from inappropriate uses of metrics and also the use of rankings in research assessment. So I hope we'll have come a long way on that. Talking more personally, I do really hope that in 10 years' time, we'll really be able to rely on a range of tools and criteria that are quite innovative compared to what we have today. And that we've been able to build on research to come to those, and at least indeed, as Sarah said, have the academic consensus on what are the approaches that work through testing. And I hope that will go beyond narrative CVs. Having developed one of those CVs, I'm a strong believer in the usefulness of that tool, but it's not the golden bullet. We need to look at the entire process of evaluation that a CV sits within. And there are other elements, I think, where we have lots of work to do that sit beyond the CV, and that also think about the way in which the CV is used, but also the process and the interview process, for example, that it sits within and that it is used within. I really hope that assessment practices will underpin a balance between, on the one hand, achieving organizational strategy, but also leaving space for individual creativity, which is so important in, especially in the academic space, and I think in the research space more generally, so that organizations will be assessed against their respective missions, their strategy, their really unique objectives, and that individuals are funded and recruited, not just based on their track records, not just based on output, but looking in both directions, both at the process and also the impact that they have. Though we need to think with impact what the right aggregate level is of thinking about where that makes sense. But also an important element I'd like to add, and this is something I'm personally very keen on exploring further, is to also think about competencies. What are the competencies that they need to do all the aspects of the role they're in? And that can mean many things for delivering a research project successfully. And I think we're not really encompassing that yet in the formats and the tools, in the criteria that we're using today. So all these aspects, I hope, will be considered in recruitment, in promotion processes, but also in funding processes. And in the longer term, the things that I hope that will result in is, first of all, an increase in the quality and the impact and maximization really of the quality and impact of research. And Sarah mentioned, not everyone agrees that reforms needed to have that maximization. I strongly believe it is, and I know many in the room here today will as well. I also hope it will cause a U-turn in the current convergence in terms both of organizational missions, but also in the diversity of people, or the lack of diversity of people that we see in institutions, towards a renewed divergence where we have a diversity of people, but also a diversity of research organizations with their own unique aspects to bring. And I think more than our rank was mentioned, this is a narrative where institutions can really talk about the specific value that they bring. And then finally, I also hope that there will be, and this is again an element I'm personally very keen on, that there will be more emphasis on the process, as Judith mentioned, but also the competencies that people need to fulfill their role on the individual assessment level. And that will really lead to an increase in the quality of people management supervision, a decreased divide between the academic and the support staff, and also an increased mobility between sectors with two-way movement, very, very fluidic dynamic between academia and other sectors. And I'll end there.
Thank you. Another extraordinarily comprehensive answer. Thank you. We are running out of time a little bit. We're going to overrun by a few minutes, so I hope most people can stay with us for that. But I do want to give Stephanie and Disa a chance to give their thoughts on what they think research assessment will look like in 10 years' time. And then we'll have closing remarks from Hayley Hazlitt. Stephanie, let me turn to you first.
Sure. And I don't know how much more there is to say, but I can always say something. So I think a few things that I think just to say, Judith, as you were listing out your 7 points, I was like, check, 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 check. These are wonderful. And it goes beyond how I would have framed it. So thank you so much for that wonderful list. I think one thing that is happening already is that in 10 years' time, I think it will be a bit more common knowledge, like how to critically assess metrics and the ways of assessing research. That's becoming kind of a layer to research assessment that the individual researcher might know a bit more about, the processes, the practices, the strengths and limitations of different approaches. So I think that kind of metrics literacy and assessment literacy is almost becoming another research skill that folks are learning. I think if I could touch on a bit in terms of kind of that more equitable research assessment landscape, I think one thing that would be near and dear to my heart would be that there would be equitable and I don't know if inclusive is the right word, but equitable support, mentorship, and openness that's not just based on, you know, coming from a prestigious institution, as others have said. I think just really being able to have practices and policies in place that do enable us to assess individuals on their own merit. And I think we're a long way from that. There's still a lot of emphasis placed on, you know, prestige of the pedigree of a researcher. And I think that's deeply problematic for so many reasons that we're all aware of. But I think that really needs to change. So transparency and commitment to the transparency of the criteria being used to assess. I think we have some really great movements towards that, but what we're still hearing right now is that even if the policies say, you know, these are the criteria, the conversation in the room is a little different. And I think that's taking time to actually change that culture. So I think a lot more, again, 10 years time, I don't know if it'll take that long, but I suspect it will. I think that will be a perennial academic assessment conversation and challenge. And I think one thing that comes up a lot, but is true respect for different worldviews. For example, Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing, and connecting, really being able to walk those parallel paths together in a good way. And then hopefully extending that to broader communities as well. There are so many different worldviews and approaches to lived experience, to research, to worldview constructs that I am not at all well versed to speak about. But I think that provides just such an amazing opportunity to really consider what research can be. And I think we're going to keep talking about some of the challenges about, you know, no matter what, folks find ways to kind of game the system. So how do we keep having that conversation about equity and the individual context that teases that out a little bit? And of course, AI, I think we're going to have some really big conversations, even as we move towards more narrative approaches. I think there's a lot of opportunities for, you know, machine learning, chat GPT to level some of these playing fields, but ideally the systems can change so that we don't really need to use machine learning to level the playing field. So that's, those are some of my
Thank you very much.
additions.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. You know, they were very valuable additions, they were too. And finally, Andisa, let me give you the last word on where you see the future in 10 years.
Yes, and I think the panelists touch on everything, and in also the interest of time, I think a holistic view to the research process, to research impact, and also that aspect of inclusivity in the process and not just the outcome, the different ways of knowing, equitable ways. And I guess also something else, it's human. It has to be human. These are humans that are doing research. That aspect does not, we don't just lose it when one gets involved or in assessment, but also from my context, decolonized. We talk about this all the time and we adopt these practices without little questioning and interrogating. So that would be critical from my side in 10 years' time. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was short, but extremely pithy and extremely worthwhile. Thank you very much, Andisa. And thank you very much to all 4 members of the panel, Judith, Andisa, Stephanie, and Karen. That was a really fantastic conversation. So please, can I invite the audience again to use your reaction buttons to clap and applaud our fantastic panel. And I apologize for my appalling timekeeping and hand back to Haley to give us our closing remarks. Thank you.
No problem, Stephen. It was a pleasure to sit in and listen to the fantastic discussion. I won't keep y'all long. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I just want to close this out with some acknowledgements and a follow-up of what we've got planned for the rest of the month. So first and foremost, a huge thank you to the panelists and our keynote speaker, Sarah DeRica. This would not have been possible without you, without your phenomenal insights and thoughts and ideas. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for participating today. I'd also like to acknowledge the folks who made this possible. First and foremost, Anna Hatch, DORA's first program director, who was instrumental in early planning for DORA at 10 as well as just instrumental for the growth of DORA as a whole. Next, an incredibly warm acknowledgement of DORA's chairs, Stephen Curry and Ginny Barber. Stephen, you've been a fantastic moderator for this entire session. Both Stephen and Ginny have volunteered countless hours of their own time to make DORA and this celebration what it is today. So many, many thanks to you. The steering committee and executive board also donate their time to help shape the vision and priorities for DORA. And speaking of donating time, a big thanks to our steering committee members who volunteered to be a part of the 10th anniversary task force to make this all happen. Laura Ravelli from FOLEC, Claire Moulton from the Company of Biologists, Stephen and Ginny as well. And finally, a big thanks to policy associates Queen Saikia and Sudeepa Nandi, who have been helping as moderators in our chat. And many thanks to Chris Hartgerink of Liberate Science for their wisdom and support with local event management, logistics, moderating these sessions, and creating the What Does DORA Mean to Me video. I'd like to end the call with a reminder that there's just so much more that we have going on for the month of May to celebrate our 10th anniversary. So please keep an eye on our Twitter at DORA Assessment and our webpage, sfdora.org, for the plenary recordings, which will be shared later this week, and a DORA retrospective blog that Ginny and I have authored, and we will release that at the end of the week to really cap things off. I saw this question in the chat. Yes, we will be sharing summaries of the plenary sessions with key takeaways and learnings. These will be released in the coming weeks. I'd also like to say that we have over 20 local events from 15 different countries celebrating DORA at 10. These are events that have been organized by folks who want to talk about DORA, and they really span the gamut of many, many different topics. And so I would highly encourage you to register for one of the upcoming 12 hybrid or virtual events that are open to the public. And if you're inspired by what you saw today, we are still accepting local event submissions. So if you are inspired to pull your colleagues into a coffee chat or a seminar, let us know. And we'd be very happy to feature that as part of DORA at 10. And if you would like to register for any of these events or submit an event proposal, you can find that at sfdora.org. And finally, I'd like to thank the audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions. This passionate community has made the movement what it is today, and it is this same community that will continue to innovate, implement, and iterate responsible research assessment reform into the next decade. We look forward to the next 10 years with you. And with that, we'll bring this session to a close. Thank you.